Good morning. This is going to be the fourth lecture, very short tape for the second testing period of History 2303. I want to talk a little bit about pioneer institutions in Texas as Texas was preparing to break away and join the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. By 1861, the patterns of civilization in Texas have been firmly established. Texas was part of the Old South, but yet it was part of the New West as well. The state's economy came from the Old South. It was based on slavery and cotton. But the frontier of the West gave Texas a sort of lawless flavor where men outnumbered women, and with a high percentage of immigrants from Mexico and Europe. By 1860, foreigners constituted more than one-third of the population of Texas. By 1860, 20% of the population, for instance, of Houston and San Antonio and Galveston were German immigrants who came to Texas in the late 1840s and 1850s. By 1860, the second largest ethnic group in Texas were Hispanic Texans. And these Hispanic Texans were very much so discriminated after the 1836 Texas Revolution, when many land grants and titles to land held by Hispanics were challenged. And indeed, Mexican workers began to migrate back into Texas after the Texas Revolution, beginning literally in the 1850s, with many Hispanics, Mexicans coming to Texas and settling on farms, working as laborers. Most of these Hispanics laborers were poor, financially not well off, but some became significant leaders in their communities, such as Santos Benavides. Santos Benavides eventually became the mayor of Laredo, and during the American Civil War held a Confederate generalship in the Confederate military. He later served in the Texas legislature. And there was Jose Navarro. Jose Navarro was a participant in the 1836 Texas Revolution, a writer of the 1845 state constitution for Texas, and a member of the Texas legislature in the 1850s. By 1860, one-third of the Texas population were slaves, black slaves. But Texas also had, in that year, in the census of 1860, 355 free blacks who made Texas their home. Most free blacks were poor, but the Goyen family of Nacogdoches and the Ashworth family of Jefferson County were both black landholders, families, and both of the families, the Goyens and the Ashworths, not only owned land as black men, but they also owned slaves as well. Occupationally, the most common occupation for labor in Texas was day laborer, and indeed there were very few professional people in Texas by 1860. The census of 1860 revealed approximately 900 doctors, 758 clergy, 1,471 lawyers, which was probably too many for the state of Texas in 1860, but yet only 65 dentists and only 8 architects in the entirety of Texas in 1860. Farming was the principal occupation, with 50,000 farmers, families farming in Texas by 1860. The acreage, improved numbers of acres under agriculture almost quadrupled from 1850 to 1860, while the value of farms from 1850 to 1860 increased fivefold. to $88 million by 1860. Cotton was the main crop in Texas, but corn was raised by many to feed the poor and working farm animals. Sweet potatoes, wheat, and sugarcane until 1852 were the other primary crops in the Republic of Texas. In antebellum Texas, slavery and the cotton culture went hand in hand. For instance, the population of Texas, white population of Texas, grew from 1850 to 1860 by 180%, but the percentage of slaves in Texas grew 214% from 1850 to 1860. The value in 1850 for tax purposes of an average slave was $357. By 1860, tax purposes, a slave was worth $672 a year. The aggregate value of slaves was approximately 10% more than the aggregate value of agriculture. Agriculture was $88 million by 1860, and there were $97 million worth of slaves in Texas by 1860. At an auction, a field hand brought between $1,200 and $2,000, and a plowboy, a young slave, brought between $1,000 to $1,500. Slaves also could be rented out at approximately $200 to $300 a year per slave. As the demand for black labor increased, so did the desire for reopening the African slave trade. And you remember that Hardin Runnels, who Houston defeated in 1858, who defeated Houston in 56, and then Houston defeated Runnels in 1858. Hardin Runnels, as governor, was a supporter of reopening the African slave trade. Even though Texas never reopened the African slave trade, an illicit slave trade from Africa brought thousands through Galveston and other Texas ports, and so did the pressure on blacks in slavery to seek freedom. And it was estimated by about 1860 that about 4,000 slaves a year fled either to Mexico or attempted to flee into the Indian Territory and take their chances among the Indians in the Indian Territory. Rural life in Texas involved a frame-dwelling double log cabin called a dog run house. Very often these simple cabins would have a kitchen or a smokehouse separate from the main part of the house, might be added later. And glass windows were an exception, not the rule. In most small homes had screen or didn't have glass windows. The Germans tended to have better homes made of stone. And the average food for a rural citizen of Texas was a diet of salt pork, cornbread, and syrup. But life in cities was not much better. In fact, the streets of most Texas cities were unpaved. Galveston in 1857 led the way when it paved its most traveled street, the Strand, with seashells. In 1860, San Antonio became the first Texas city to install gas lights and to create a fire association, again in 1860. In most Texas communities, the very best buildings tended to be hotels, such as the Menger Hotel that was built in San Antonio in 1859. Only the wealthy and professional people stayed in hotels like the Menger. Most average travelers, Texas travelers, settled or at least spent the night in barns and bunked out with the animals on hay, etc. Most merchants had a very primitive and limited amount of stock because on hand because supplies had to be procured from New Orleans and other cities. And banking, a lack of banking and a lack of capital obviously was a problem during the Republic of Texas years and the years between the annexation of Texas and the Civil War. Transportation lagged throughout the state, with rivers capable of handling only small boats, boat traffic, and roads were horrific in Texas. They were dusty during the summer, and they turned into quagmires of mud during the rainy season in the winter. Freighters and stage lines provided the bulk of transportation, and travel was uncomfortable. It was often dangerous and very expensive. Federal mail subsidies existed on the longer stage lines, and by 1860, the state finally had reasonably decent mail delivery. But post offices were scarce in San Antonio. It was 1850 before the first post office was established in San Antonio. In terms of public health, epidemics took a heavy toll throughout the history of Texas. Back in 1833, cholera killed 80 citizens of Brazoria and virtually wiped out the little community of Velasco. In 1834, 91 citizens died at Goliad from cholera. In 1846, typhus killed dozens in the Central Texas German communities. And common diseases included such things as yellow fever, inflammation of the eyes, believe it or not, inflammation of the eyes, rheumatism, measles, whooping cough, and smallpox were also very common diseases. Patent medicines, cancer cures, cough remedies, and quinine was sold to assist the health of the citizens of Texas. But brandy, cayenne pepper, and mustard were the favorite pre-Civil War medications of the average citizen. State Medical Association was finally organized in 1853 under the leadership of Dr. Ashabel Smith and J.W. Throckmorton as leading members. And in the following year, 1854, Dr. Ferdinand Charles von Herf of San Antonio performed the first major medical operation utilizing chloroform. Dr. von Herf was brave enough to journey outside the city of San Antonio and pull the infected tooth of a Comanche war chief, and he anesthetized him with chloroform and successfully performed a tooth removal. In terms of crime, vice, and existence of lawlessness, well, Texas was a very lawless place. Many offenses were punishable by death, and whipping and branding was often frequently used. With no penitentiary until 1849, local jails were used, but most often vigilantism was the order of the day. For instance, in 1852, 12 San Antonians were hanged by vigilantes. Gambling, very common. 1842, a Harris County grand jury indicted 77 citizens of Houston for excessive card playing. Betting on horses was common, and drinking and drunkenness was widespread in the state of Texas. The temperance movement, called the Sons of Temperance, arrived in Texas in 1848, with a major supporter of temperance being the former alcoholic Sam Houston, governor of Texas. In 1854, Texas law permitted county electors by majority vote to forbid the sale of alcohol in quantities of less than a quart. You could still buy quantities more than a quart, so you had a considerable number of Texas alcoholics. But an effort was made to institute prohibition on the county level. 41 Texas counties voted on a prohibition measure, and 35 adopted prohibition in quantities of less than a quart. but the Supreme Court of Texas declared that law unconstitutional, and prohibition never went into effect before the Civil War. Of all the forces affecting Texas society, the greatest influence was the churches, and the Methodists and the Baptists and then the Presbyterians entered Texas before the Civil War. The Methodists came first, led by Martin Reuter. By 1840, the Methodist Texas Conference was organized with 1,878 members in 25 local parishes. By 1860, those numbers had increased to 30,661 members with 224 local traveling Methodist ministers. Since the Baptists lacked a church hierarchy, that is to say that autonomy rested with local congregations, it was really easy for the Baptists to set up churches on the frontier of Texas. The Baptist Pilgrim Church was brought intact to Texas by Daniel Parker from Illinois in 1834, and the very first Texas Baptist church organized in Independence, Texas in 1837. The Independence Church had none other than Sam Houston as a member of the Independence congregation. By 1860, there were 500 Baptist churches in Texas, and the Baptists led all denominations in the number of church publications. Presbyterians began their work in Texas in 1837, establishing churches at Independence, Houston, Austin, and Galveston. By 1860, the Presbyterians had over 2,200 members in 72 church structures. The Episcopals had 19 church structures in Texas by 1860, and the Christian Church had 39. In addition, the Catholic Church by 1860 maintained 33 parishes throughout the state of Texas. Churches were the great leveling and the great civilizing impact in Texas, because Sunday schools provided biblical and moral training, and in very good Sunday schools had libraries attached to them. So very soon, Bible classes, temperance societies, and educational interests followed. The churches provided socializing efforts for the families of those out on the frontier. Associated with the churches, and the next most influential on the people, were lodges. And the Freemasons, the Masonic Lodge, was supported by prominent Texans, including Sam Houston and Anson Jones. By 1860, there were 252 Masonic lodges with over 10,000 Texans as Masons. Many schools were maintained by these lodges. The Independent Order of Oddfellows also existed, due to the organizing efforts of Jacob de Cordova, the renowned Austin publisher and land agents. The Oddfellows offered sick and survivor benefits to its members, and the Oddfellows expanded to 74 lodges and 3,000 members by 1860. In fact, civilization had arrived at last on the frontier of Texas, just about the time that Texans were unfortunately crazy enough to attempt to break away from the United States and to amalgamate with the Confederate States of America. At this point, I want to stop. This has been a short tape, but when we come back, we will, in a subsequent fifth and sixth lecture, talk about the secession movement and the Civil War in Texas. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the clouds.